We didn't run out of energy. We're just running out of freedom.
4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's how close Texas was from a total power grid collapse.
How did Texas end up in this position?
All of this is about control.
I mean, the Chinese love this. They love the announcement on Earth Day from President Biden. $7 billion for rooftop solar. That's rooftop solar that's made in China by slave labor and made in a plant powered by coal that doesn't have any pollution control technology.
The irony of it all is China's the biggest climate criminal in the world.
Just like you probably haven't spent much time thinking about electricity generation, you probably don't think about China. But the nation state is constantly thinking about you. China is our biggest geopolitical rival. They don't want us to prosper. So why are we flooding their economy with cash for solar panels and wind turbines? As we highlighted earlier in this podcast, solar and wind energy are unreliable and expensive. They're also heavily subsidized. Texans are being bled dry.
Enron level accounting gimmicks that are being done to the taxpayer's detriment, because not only are we have an increased tax burden for all the money that's being printed to the benefit of the Chinese.
So, not only are we paying to develop the infrastructure, but we're paying higher costs for the power that's produced. And the technology doesn't last nearly as long as promised. In this, the final episode of the season, we'll take a more in-depth look at China, its involvement in undermining affordable energy in Texas, and how we could end up in a bind if geopolitical tensions continue to rise. From Texas Scorecard, I'm Daniel Greer, and this is Exposed. Lights out.
If it weren't for renewable energy subsidies, there wouldn't be a single wind turbine in Texas. There wouldn't be a single solar panel. They are so uneconomical.
The whole thing is about charging us more money. The whole thing is about controlling our life and our behaviors. And in terms of the environment, it makes absolutely almost no difference whatsoever.
When you talk about the fragility of our grid, for example, there are 16 or 17 substations that if compromised, our whole grid goes down.
I started seeing the tentacles of China wrapping themselves around countries and strangling them.
They got to build their economy up and grow their economy, so they are producing reliable power. And so they're using coal predominantly heavily to do it. They're doing some gas, but it's really heavily coal.
This is a weakening of America.
The Chinese are laughing all the way to the bank while Americans are getting crushed. Increased tax burdens and significantly increased cost of electricity.
You may not appreciate this fully, but China has a long-term plan to dominate the world. And the way they plan to accomplish this goal is through infiltration. The projects the central government has launched in countries around the world may seem like detached one-offs, but they are, in fact, part of a vast, interconnected plan. Here's Kyle Bass, a businessman and expert on China, speaking to this technique.
Yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative is really, it's a Chinese Trojan horse. It is them lending to places where they want strategic. They either want the resources, or they want a deep draft port for their Navy, or they want a road from Montenegro to Russia.
The Belt and Road Initiative is an infrastructure investment scheme that China kicked off in 2013. What started with the CCP providing capital for roads, energy, and mining in other countries has morphed over time. Cultural initiatives and institutes have made their way to America and to Texas. This was explored in Season 3 of Exposed.
Using the name of an ancient Chinese philosopher as a Trojan horse, Confucius Institutes were set up to appear as an international network of educational programs providing Chinese language instruction, organizing cultural activities, and hosting Chinese speakers. However, these organizations had, and still have, a secondary political purpose that transcends the teaching of basic Chinese language and culture. In this case, the Chinese government wasn't hiding their intentions. In 2011, Li Qingcheng, a former member of the Chinese government, described Confucius Institutes as
an appealing brand for expanding Chinese culture abroad. It has made an important contribution toward improving our soft power. The Confucius brand has a natural attractiveness. Using the excuse of teaching Chinese language, everything looks reasonable and logical.
In countries like Pakistan and South Africa, China started with a limited footprint in energy generation as part of its Belt and Road Initiative, only to grow it over time. In both countries, wind and solar are prioritized to this day. In the U.S., China has purchased farmland and is acquiring companies in various sectors. Most Texans don't realize that China has firm control over the pecan industry here and in neighboring New Mexico. But pecans aren't their sole interest. Jason Isaac, a policy expert with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, elaborates.
There's about 140,000 acres. It was owned by a CCP general. Really, it was owned by an LLC formed in Houston, but owned and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese, the way they work, if you're a business and you're affiliated or even closely related to China, then you've got to have a member of the Communist Party as part of your employees, and you've got to pay them. It's communism.
State Senator Lois Kolkhorst led action against this.
And so she was able to get a bill passed that basically said they couldn't connect to the grid. And so I think what they've done is they've just leased it off to an Italian company.
Where we see China enmeshed in companies, the policies that the CCP pushes are pursued. And these connections start innocuously enough. For instance, China and Italy have had strong interconnections. Until 2023, Italy was a participant in the Belt and Road Initiative, a partnership it entered in 2019. Analysis of the spread of COVID outside of China had cases popping up in Italy as early as September 2019. This is due to the fact that Italian and Chinese workers traveled between the countries regularly, with strong ties in the textile and clothing industries.
The northern part of Italy has been a traditionally prosperous region due to its flourishing fashion and garment industry. With China offering one of the cheapest manufacturing options in the world, it came as little surprise that most of these fashion brands were working with China.
After exiting the Belt and Road Initiative in 2023, Italy outlawed the placement of solar panels on farmland in 2024. As we explored in Episode 3, solar panel sprawl has to be vast to supply enough power to offset dispatchable energy. Maybe Italy is onto something. The U.S., under both the Trump and Biden-Harris administrations, has been hostile towards the Belt and Road Initiative and China more broadly. However, China's tentacles can be seen all over the U.S., and we're funding the effort. Here's Kyle Bass.
We are funding the Belt and Road Initiative with our credit rating. It's hard to believe that.
One of the largest recipient nations of World Bank funding was China. And I thought, wait, this is the number 2 economy in the world. Why are they getting this borderline free money?
The second voice you heard is Eric Bethel. He had an up-close view of how the U.S. is backing China as the United States representative to the World Bank. The Chinese have drained cash from the World Bank, funding meant to be given to developing countries. The International Monetary Fund, which is funded by the U.S., has given China tremendous leverage over countries around the world that are important to the development of technology due to their mineral deposits, which are used to build microchips and batteries.
Now the situation is such that 80% of China's loan portfolio is in financially distressed countries. This means also that these countries are having trouble repaying the loans that they had taken on in BRI 1.0 years. Another statistic to keep in mind is that 55% of loan payments are now due for repayments. And our projections are that by 2030, 75% of the portfolio will be due for repayments. And remember, this is happening at a time when interest rates are incredibly high. Benchmark interest rates, LIBOR and SHIBOR, which are used in these loans, are at record high levels.
The scales fell from my eyes, so to speak, when I started seeing this happen, not just in one or two, but many, many countries around the world. And I started seeing the tentacles of China, right, wrapping themselves, around countries and strangling them. And it's wrong.
Prioritizing wind and solar has meant that China, a country that's historically been an importer of energy, is becoming an exporter. Here's Kyle Bass crystallizing the problem.
Imagine if they could all of a sudden become the world's go-to energy source. Heretofore, they had not been an energy source. They had been an energy buyer, right? So our reliance on them for wind and solar puts them in a very important position on the global stage, especially with our desire to clean up the environment.
While the US and Europe incur higher costs for electricity, China continues to ramp up consumption of cheap coal. By extension, they're also increasing emissions that the US says it's trying to combat. Luke Dunn, an oil and gas executive and energy expert, agrees with others we've interviewed.
This idea of responsibly produced ideas, those high energy intensive solar panels and the concrete and the resins that go into making wind turbines come from China, which is, I think, last time I saw 80%, roughly 80% coal for their electricity. So you're building all this renewable infrastructure with coal power, and will continue to be that way. China continues to add more and more coal generation.
Kyle Bass echoes these sentiments.
If you look at the emissions, over a 20-year period, the U.S. has grown its GDP by more than 100%, and yet we have cut our emissions by 25% over a 20-year period. Europe has been able to cut their emissions 31% over that same period. So the U.S. and Europe are really doing a yeoman's job of cutting emissions. China has increased theirs almost 600%. And they haven't stopped. They build a new coal-fired power plant every 3 days. When you have a closed society like China, when you have a society with diametrically opposed cultural values to ours, you have a society run by a totalitarian madman who tramples basic human rights, and you have a society that wants to embrace all human rights. When those two societies end up integrating, it is like a prize fight with your arms behind your back because there's no reciprocity.
The U.S. posture towards China started shifting in the 1990s during the Clinton administration and continued into the 2000s. Kyle Bass explains some of the broader thinking behind the shift.
I think in 2001, trying to open the economy to China, allowing them into the WTO and giving them most favored nation trading status is a good bet. Hoping they would westernize, hoping they would embrace human rights and embrace, let's say, the developed world's rules-based order. But at some point in time, you have to realize it was a bad bet.
Now, Bass advocates for clearly defining the risk that China poses to the U.S.
If you had President Biden say, the Chinese are not our strategic competitor, they're actually our enemy, then you can define the battle space. But if you can't define your enemy, you can't define the battle space.
John Ratcliffe did just that during his time as the Director of National Intelligence. Here he is speaking at the Heritage Foundation.
China is both. They are both an adversary and a competitor, but they should be more of a competitor and less of an adversary, and it's the other way around right now.
What's wild about Texas spending money on Chinese tech is we have what we need here.
And yet we're subsidizing an enemy country and allowing them to build it, and then we're bringing them over here, and it's making us more unreliable. It's actually going to be a detriment to our businesses and our citizens. So it's kind of an awakening moment.
That's Senator Kolkhorst, who's been working to bring Texas energy production back into balance. Solar panels aren't just being produced to the detriment of ratepayers in Texas. They're also being produced at great cost to the environment, according to the environmentalists' own measures for cleanliness. Again, here are businessmen Eric Bethel and Kyle Bass.
But there's a great degree of intellectual dishonesty when you consider the fact that China is a primarily coal-fired electricity generating country. And so you take coal and you burn it to make electricity that then makes solar panels. Then we buy the solar panels and we were like, oh, we're so good.
It's not just the coal that's problematic for Texas's consumption of Chinese solar panels. They're also violating human rights in their production.
And let's add to this intellectual dishonesty. 80% or 90% of the photovoltaic material that goes into solar panels comes from Xinjiang, and a lot of it is made by slave factories of ethnic Uyghur minorities. Yeah. So let that sink in, right?
What about when the solar panels reach the end of their lifespan? Will we be able to replace them reliably? Though it might change, the US and China have had an increasingly fraught relationship. As we experienced during COVID, China has an authoritarian regime and a China-first approach to everything, including business partnerships. Here's Steve Koonin talking about the bind that exists when it comes to China and its grasp on the materials needed to produce wind, solar, and battery components.
We need new supply chains. A major part of the energy transition is going to be technologies that employ exotic materials, relatively exotic. Lithium, more copper, cobalt, manganese, rare earths, because renewable energies have to harvest energy over very large areas, and they need to be very efficient at harvesting it. So you need fancy magnets and conductors and so on. So you got to rejigger the supply chains. And right now, China has got a market on the processing of these exotic materials, and that's causing grief.
If you put it all together, having an unreliable grid, a grid that is too dependent on renewable energy, the Green New Deal, you're actually moving America away from being a superpower.
One thing is abundantly clear. The decisions we make today will shape the future of Texas, and perhaps the nation in the decades to come. China's influence is no longer a distant threat. The adversary is here, entangled in our economy and energy policies. If we continue down this path, the cost won't just be higher electricity bills. It could be our sovereignty. The stakes have never been higher. As we close out this season, we can no longer ignore the writing on the wall. We saw in episode 1 how subsidies for unreliable green energy have driven reliable sources offline. Removing coal and gas-fired plants from our energy mix leaves us vulnerable to devastating blackouts like the winter storm of 2021. Lives were lost, but those in power seem more focused on appeasing climate activists than securing our energy future. In episode 2, we uncovered radicals seizing on our power crisis to push Texas into the national grid. Such a move would strip away our independence and control. What we know about these so-called fixes is they don't work. The same weather events that impact Texas will impact our neighbors, which could leave us in the dark when we need power the most. Production isn't our only problem, as we learned in episode 3. Cyber attacks, EMPs, and physical assaults on our grid could cripple Texas for weeks, maybe longer. We're unprepared, yet lawmakers have repeatedly turned a blind eye to these very real dangers. And here we are in episode 4, facing the chilling truth that China, the world's biggest polluter and human rights abuser, is profiting off of our dependence on solar panels and wind turbines. Every dollar we send their way strengthens a geopolitical enemy who doesn't want us to thrive. Thankfully, Texans are tough, independent, and resilient. We deserve better. We'll make sure no one can take that from us. We've weathered storms before, and we've fought to protect our way of life. It's time for Texans to act, to rebuild our energy grid with reliable sources, reject DC's takeover, and reclaim our bright future. Together, as the people of Texas, we can ensure that our state does not go quietly into that night, and that our lights won't ever go out again. Thank you for listening to this season of Exposed. We'd like to thank Kyle Bass, Luke Dunn, and State Senator Lois Kolkhorst for participating in interviews featured in this podcast.
Exposed is a product of Texas Scorecard, the leading source on government and culture in Texas. For more information, go to texasscorecard.com.